with a little. So, my name is David Staples. Thank you for joining us for the webinar today. So today we're going to be talking about 5 different types of cybersecurity mistakes that people commonly make. A little bit about my background. So I do teach a variety of different classes, everything from the CompTIA A+ and Network Plus, the Security Plus, the new Cybersecurity Analyst Plus or CSA Plus, the CompTIA Advanced Security Practitioner or CASP. So of course, all these different certifications require you to know a lot of different types of concepts. And do want to thank Patrick Lane for joining us today as well. He is actually the Director of Products with CompTIA, so thank you, Patrick, for joining us here. And so as we go through and we talk about some of these different things, feel free to leave some questions in the chat box, and I'll try and get to those as we can. I don't really have the ability to see it as I'm talking, but of course I will be able to get to those at the end here, so we'll talk about any sort of questions that you've got here at the end of the webinar. But again, thank you for tuning in. We certainly appreciate you coming in. Of course, the webinar today is sponsored by ATG Learning. You should see a little logo up at the top right of your screen here with our URL. It's www.atglearning.com. So a little bit about my background. I've been working in IT really since I was in high school. I actually did the business study program where I left roughly about halfway through the day and then ended up actually going into an office. And I've worked for some rather large companies, the last one being roughly about 50,000 employees in 130 countries. The company before that, we had roughly also about 50,000 employees, but based just here in the United States. And of course, security is one of those things that really it doesn't matter what industry you work in. IT is something that affects all of us because things these days have become automated. We look at all these different systems that support our sales department, our finance department, various different technicians and engineers out in the field. So we need to be aware of these various different things that we need to do to actually secure our enterprise and make sure that things are actually going to be protected, right? So again, if you've got any questions about the things that we're talking about, feel free to leave those in the chat box, and we'll try and get to those here at some point. But we'll go ahead and get right into the content itself, since I know that we are running a little bit late here since we had a few audio issues. But the very first thing that I want to talk about is password cracking. And that is our first mistake, that a lot of people tend to believe that just having a password of 8 characters is going to be sufficient. Back in the day, in the mid-'80s, maybe the early '90s or so, 8 characters was just fine. We had our 386, our 486 computers on up into the 586, 686, and Pentiums. And so it really took a lot of processing power back then to really be able to crack a password. As technology continues to evolve, though, we can crack these things really, really quickly. In fact, the demonstration that I'm going to be showing you here is on Kali Linux. I've got a virtual machine running here that will actually see just how quickly we can actually crack a password. So I'm going to go ahead and flip over to that, and hopefully my audio is going to carry over here as well. It looks like it has. So that's good. So we'll come over and flip into Kali Linux. So let's just go ahead and add in a user here. So I'm going to add in a user named Patrick, just so that we've got a user to work with. And so of course what I want to do is go ahead and set up a password for him. So we'll say just use the word password. Okay, so it's going to ask me to confirm it. I'm just going to put in the rest of this information as being blank and hit that yes, it is correct. Now, I know that perhaps people on this webinar are watching are saying, well, no one really uses the word password, right? Well, wrong. People do actually use the word password. In fact, someone brought a laptop to me just within the last couple of days, asking me to take a look at it, and I said, well, it's password protected. What's the password to get in? Can you write it down for me? Thinking that it would have at least a little bit of complexity, right? So, of course, the password was password, all lowercase. This kind of stuff happens. And, of course, if we're using these types of passwords in our enterprise or in places where we really do want to secure something, they're really not that secure. And so what I'm going to do here is, of course, I've got a user that I've just added named Patrick, and hopefully Patrick here is not using the word password as his password. So we're going to basically start off by looking at the password file. So on Linux, of course, passwords are stored in a shadow file in our etc directory, right? So if I come over here to /etc and I can say cat shadow, I can actually see all the various entries in this particular server. So what I'll do next is I'm going to go ahead and take this entry for Patrick, and we're going to say cat shadow. I'm going to pull out just the line for Patrick, so I'm going to say grep Patrick. And then I'm basically going to write that into its own little file here over in my root directory, so /root/shadow copy. And so now if I come over here to my home directory, which is /root, and do an ls, I can see that I've got my new shadow copy file. And we'll say cat shadow copy, just so that you can see that that is the only line that's in there. Of course, I don't really want to go through and try and crack the dstables and root password itself, just because those are a good bit more complex and it does take a lot longer to be able to crack one of those passwords. So now I've got a copy of the file. Let's go ahead and actually pull up our password cracking application here. So I'm using Kali Linux, which of course is basically a hacker's toolbox. It has all sorts of different utilities in there that we can use to crack passwords. Now, some of them are going to be text-based, some of them are graphical-based. For our purposes here today, I wanted to share just one of the graphical-based ones because it is a fairly easy-to-use application. So if I come over here to Applications and I come down to Password Attacks, you can see that we've got this application here named Johnny. So this is basically a graphical front end for John the Ripper. And so of course it's saying it can't read the password file, so that's fine because I haven't really set it up to use that particular one yet. I'm going to come in here to Open Password File, and then we need to basically tell it which file we want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and choose my shadow copy file and click on Open. So as you can see here, it's read through the file, it's determined how many users are there and what the hashes are of those passwords. You can actually see how the password was encrypted. So here it's saying that it's using SHA 512 crypt, or SHA 512. Some people say SHA, some people say SHA. Either one is just fine. But of course, now that we have opened the file and told it where we want to crack, we basically just come right over here and say Start New Attack. And so of course, this shouldn't really take more than just a couple of seconds, as you should see here momentarily. And there it is. There's our password, a password. So that was what, about 4 or 5 seconds or so? So let's say, okay, well, maybe permutations will help us here, right? So let's go ahead and try and set a new password for Patrick here. So we'll say PASSWD Patrick. And so this will allow us to reset his password. So I'm going to reset it with a 0 instead of just the letter O. PASSW0RD. So that's been updated. So let's just go ahead and do another cat/etsy/shadow. And we're going to grep Patrick, write that out to /root/shadow copy. Okay, and so if I come back over here to my John the Ripper, or Johnny the Ripper, and we're going to open that password file back up, /shadow copy, and then of course click Start New Attack. And again, this really shouldn't take all that long. Theoretically, it's usually within about 5 to 10 seconds or so. But as you can see, even just changing one single letter does not really help us. And of course, I could use a capital P, I could use a capital D. It's really not going to be all that picky. But just adding some numbers into our passwords and doing what we call permutations of these passwords is not going to help you with your passwords. You really need to be looking at using much longer lengths. So for those of you who have taken some of my classes, or some of you who haven't, or watched some of my videos, you may know that we do a lot of business with the military. And of course, I can't probably give away the amount of characters that the military requires, but I can tell you that it's a sufficient number that you shouldn't really have to worry about cracking their passwords. Corporations should really be using the same thing. We should really be getting away from using just an 8-character password and moving on to 10 characters, 12 characters at a very, very minimum, preferably up in the 14, 16 characters. And so we need to be looking at things like passphrases instead of passwords. I know some people say, well, you know, that's hard. I don't really want to have to remember something that long. Well, it really doesn't have to be that difficult of a password. It can be basically some sort of a phrase that you remember. In fact, I saw a really great interview with Edward Snowden. He was doing an interview with John Oliver on last week's News Tonight, and he was mentioning the same thing. And John Oliver's response as well was, well, you know, this all sounds great, but the problem is I'm not going to do it. Well, this is kind of where us as IT people kind of need to step in and say, okay, well, we basically create the password policies, right? So if you're going to allow people to access a system, you can set up a password policy to make sure that people are using at least 12, 14, 16 characters, whatever the minimum is that you want to use. But definitely you want to move beyond that 8 that we've talked about for so long. So what are some examples of different passwords that we could use? So let's just pull up a little text editor here. I think LeafPad should work. So what are some things that you can use as a password? Now, of course, I'm not going to share my actual passwords with you here, but for instance, here's one that I came up with just for this webinar. It's I love hash, just use the hash symbol here, Browns at Waffle House, and you can add an exclamation point if you want to. And of course, that's going to be a total of, I believe that's 25 characters if I'm not mistaken. Now, things like this should be a very easy to remember phrase that you can still type in the appropriate number of characters that once you hash this, it's going to be fairly difficult to crack. And just to kind of show you using that particular example, we're going to go ahead and set Patrick's password to that. So passwd Patrick. And so our new password is going to be I love hash symbol Browns at Waffle House. Enter, and you can see it does take an extra moment or so to type this in. And so that password's been updated. So let's just go ahead and rerun the command to put that back out to a shadow copy file. And so, of course, then we need to basically come back into our John the Ripper, which I didn't think I'd close, but let's go ahead and just open up through here. Okay. And so we're going to open that password file back up, come into shadow copy. And so now when I click Start New Attack, this should not be able to just randomly crack this password within the 5, 10, 15 seconds or so. In fact, this could theoretically take days to crack. I would hope at least a minimum of days. Now, this machine, I don't really have a whole lot of resources allocated to it either. I only have 1 core of my CPU, and I only have, I think, maybe a gig of RAM or so dedicated to it. But of course, we've sat here for at least 10 seconds or so, and you can see that it's definitely a much, much bigger difference from what we had before with just the word password, right? So we're going to go ahead and flip back over here to our thing here. So some of the passwords that I've used in the past have all been basically with the standard 8 characters. Just to kind of give you some examples of things that we used to talk about, one of the root DNS servers at one of the companies that I worked for used something along these lines. And to me, that's a lot harder to remember. Of course, if you read it out as a phrase, this is basically $3 in a big hat. I know their password has been changed, so I don't really feel bad using this as an example here. But something like this is going to be fairly difficult to remember. Which one would be easy to remember? I love hash browns at Waffle House, or this $3 in a big hat. To me, the I love hash browns at Waffle House would actually be a little easier to remember. So again, passwords definitely going to be our #1 mistake that a lot of people make in the IT world. And this is both from a user perspective as well as administrator perspective. We do need to make sure that we are using much, much longer passwords than what we used in the 80s and 90s. So one of the next things I want to talk to you about is something that we call banner grabbing. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up a couple of windows here and just to kind of show you what banner grabbing is. So banner grabbing, when we go to log into a system, it basically shows us a little bit of information about that system sometimes, right? And of course, when we go to connect to a website, it also sends us information about the server. Now, this is something that most people don't see because, of course, when we access websites, we're typically doing it through something like Google Chrome. We're doing it through Firefox. We're doing it through, I guess a few people still use Internet Explorer, right? But when we access these sites, the server actually will send us the information about itself. So I'm just going to show you what those headers look like that we really don't see from a user perspective. So I'm going to do that basically using a telnet command. And just kind of show you an example here from atglearning.com. We actually host with someone else. We don't host our own, so we can't really edit this stuff ourselves. But this is the type of thing that hosting companies should be doing as well, unless they're basically manipulating those headers to kind of throw you off. But if I telnet to port 80 of atglearning.com, it will basically bring up a blank command prompt here. So what I'll do is I'm going to send the exact same sequence that your browser would send. So I'm going to say git slash, and I'm just going to use the old HTTP slash 1.0 protocol and press enter twice. And you can actually see that this is what that server sends out. So as part of the headers, after I send a GET request to it, it actually says the server that's running here is Apache version 2.4.25. Now, how difficult is it to actually go do a Google search on Apache 2.4.25 vulnerabilities? Really not that difficult, right? In fact, one of the websites that I own is actually cheapquiz.com, and just to show you that that web hosting company, which is a totally separate company, is doing basically the same thing. So that I can show you multiple web hosting companies here. So we'll say get, then a slash, HTTP slash 1.0. And again, this is basically the same exact command that your web browser would be sending here. As you can see, they're running basically a competitor to Apache. It's called Nginx, but they're also sending that version number out, 1.12.1. So if I went and did a Google search looking for Nginx 1.12.1 vulnerabilities, I really don't have to spend that much time researching to figure out how to break into the system, right? Now, on the other hand, I actually do have a Microsoft Azure account, which I'm looking at transitioning my web hosting over to because I have basically full control over those machines. So since I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and MCT, we actually have a $100 per month credit with Azure just so that we can get into these types of things and play with them so that we can kind of use them for teaching and other types of purposes. So I've just set one up yesterday so that I can use this as an example. So I'm going to say telnet 13.90.254.78 is my new IP address. And granted, I don't have really hardly anything set up on this virtual machine yet. But now if I run a git command slash 1.0, you can see that when I come up here to server, all it tells me is that it's running Nginx. It's quite a difference from the one that told me you're running Nginx 1.2 point whatever, right? So there are programs out there, especially included within the Kali Linux distribution, like I had mentioned, that will actually go out and grab the banners from these different applications and from these different services that are running. So if I want to go grab banners from some FTP servers or Telnet servers, if people are even still using Telnet, I know they are, but they really shouldn't be, right? If they want to grab it from SSH servers or any other sort of service that's running, these are the types of things that we need to go through and disable. So the very first thing that I did on this new virtual machine yesterday was actually to disable that server version from coming over. So just to kind of show you how easy that is to do, I'm going to go ahead and SSH over to that server. And so I'm going to use that same IP address, 13.90.254.78. And it's going to ask for my password. And of course, this basically logs me into that Ubuntu server, which you'll notice that it didn't actually show me the version until I had actually logged in. But if I come over here to my Etsy directory, which of course on Linux is where all of the configuration files are stored, and then I change into the Nginx directory, there's a file there called nginx.conf. So if I do sudo nginx.conf, sudo vi nginx.conf, there we go. Helps to actually put in the full command, right? So you'll see that down here there's actually a setting that's called server tokens off. So when I first came across this file yesterday, that was actually commented out. So what I did was I came in and I actually took off this little pound sign so that it uncomments it, and I added the little note over to the side just to kind of remind me that this actually prevents sending that server version. But just to show you that this does actually do exactly that, so I'm going to put this hash symbol back, and we'll write this file out, and then we'll say service nginx restart, and it's going to ask for my password. There we go. So theoretically it has made that change. So let's go ahead and actually telnet back to that site now. So say telnet 13.90.254.78, port 80. And we're going to run a GET request on it again, so GET slash HTTP slash 1.0. And then we'll just scroll right back on up here to where it says server. And now you can actually see where that is actually sending out that server version. It's saying that it's running 1.10.3 on Ubuntu. So before I forget, let's go ahead and actually edit this back just to make sure that we're not sending out that server version. And of course, this will probably be upgraded to a new version within the next couple of days. So I'm not horribly worried about, in the current version of Nginx that it's running. We should restart our Nginx service here now. And so theoretically, if I go to telnet back to this port again, we should be able to see that we are back to just server Nginx. So again, banner grabbing is going to be mistake number 2 that we aren't protecting against. A lot of people are basically sending out these versions of the different servers that they're running, and this is something that you should definitely be protecting yourselves against, because again, a Google search only takes moments to go through and look for what version of whatever software or whatever service you're actually running there. So number 3, we're going to talk about physical security. Physical security is one of those things that a lot of people say, well, why does that really matter? I mean, all you're really doing is protecting people from being able to actually get in and maybe steal, like TVs and whatever else just to reuse the computer, right? Well, if you've got confidential information, you've got private information on those types of systems, you're going to still be able to access it in one way or another, most likely, unless, of course, you're using encryption, which we're going to be talking about here next. But there's an old saying that goes, if you can touch it, you can own it. And essentially what that's saying is that anyone who has physical access to a particular system or to a device can really be able to access the information on those devices. So I've got an example here that I actually created a YouTube video a couple of weeks ago from here in the office. We had a VMware system that we were wanting to start using again, and nobody could really remember the root password to it. So what did we do? We basically hacked in and were able to crack it and basically reset that root password. I've done the same thing on a Mac, actually. Someone, I won't mention who, but I think they're actually on the webinar right now watching. But his daughter was going off to college, and he said, well, I need to be able to remove this parental software from the computer, and I don't remember my administrative password to be able to get in there and actually remove the software. And of course, as a separate user account, his daughter couldn't really go in and actually remove it, right? So what we had to do is basically boot into a single user mode on that Mac and be able to actually reset that root password and make things start working again. So I do want to show you guys that clip. I'm not going to show you the full 15-minute clip. I've edited it down to about 6 minutes or so, but just wanted to kind of show you how these types of things work and why physical security is so important. Because again, anyone that has physical access to that particular VMware server could have done exactly what I did. And if there's all sorts of confidential or proprietary information residing on that server, they now have access to it. So I'm going to go ahead and start that clip, and we'll be right back here in just a few moments. So again, I think it's roughly about 6 minutes, and we'll see you guys momentarily. Okay, so now we're entering the BIOS setup. Sure, as you probably know, the BIOS is the basic input-output system here. So what I can do here is I can scroll over to where it says Boot Manager, and it will show me the list of drives that is automatically recognized. We're going to choose the embedded RAID CD/DVD-ROM and press Enter, and you'll notice that it will now actually boot up into that live CD. So we're just going to come down here and tell it to use a Linux-based rescue environment. This is Parted Magic on here. I don't really need a GUI on here. It does have the option to boot into a GUI. For what we're doing, I'm basically just using the command prompt, so we're just going to choose console here just to hopefully speed things up a little bit because it can be kind of slow. So we're going to go ahead and choose that and wait while Linux boots up here. Okay, and we finally get to a command prompt here, so let me see if I can kind of tilt this down a little bit so you can kind of see what I'm doing here a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do first is go ahead and come into my MNT directory, and we can see that currently it has a couple of different directories there, but I need to actually mount one of the other hard drives. Now, we've already determined which hard drive it is, but I'm just going to go ahead and show you guys the list of drives that are currently here. So if I do a cat space /etc/fstab, it will show me the various drives that are here. So of course, where you see that says /SDE1 and /SDE5 /SDA1 or /SDB1 and whatnot, those are various different drives that we can mount here. But for our purposes, we're going to be using SDE5. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and first create a mount point here. So we'll say mkdir SDE5. And now I need to actually mount that drive onto that directory. So we'll say mount /dev /SDE5 onto /mnt /SDE5 and press enter. So now that drive is actually available in the directory of /mnt /SDE5. So I can do cd /SDE5 and then do an ls, which will actually show me all the files in that directory. And the password directory is actually still there from when I had gone in here a few minutes ago. I'm just going to go ahead and clear that out just so that you can see where we're basically starting from scratch here. So what I'm going to do first is create a blank directory to work in. We'll just call this temp. And helps to type in the right command, I suppose, right? So mkdir space temp. And then the file that I want over here is the state.tgz. So I'm going to say copy cp state.tgz. I want to copy that into my temp directory. And then I'm going to change into the temp directory. And you can see that that state.tgz file is there. So a .tgz file is a file that has been both tarred and gzipped. So essentially I want to decompress it as well as take all the files out. So a tar file is kind of like a zip file, but without any sort of compression there. So what we're going to do here is go ahead and do tar-xvf state.tgz. And actually I want to add my z in there as well so that we are decompressing it as well. And as you can see, it actually had a file inside of it called local.tgz. So now I want to go ahead and extract the contents of that. So we'll say tar-xvf. I know it has .tgz on it. The hack that I found for this said that there's no gzip compression on it, so -xvf is all we need. And of course the file name here is local.tgz. So when I press enter, you can see that it's going ahead and decompressing that entire file. I've got an etc directory that it created, so if I do an ls here, go ahead and move this to the bottom of the screen, so you can actually see the state.tgz and local tgz and the /etc directory that we created as well. So what I'll do here is go ahead and move into that etc directory, so cd /etc. Not /etc, cd space etc, because I want the directory that's within this one, right? Move this up just a little bit. So within that etc directory, I have a whole bunch of other files. One of those files is called shadow. Shadow file, as we know on Linux, is basically where the encrypted passwords are stored. So what I'll do is go ahead and edit that shadow file by typing vi space shadow. And that will take me into something that looks kind of like this. So you can see here's the root user, here's a whole bunch of characters that would be basically the encrypted password. So what I'll do here is go ahead and come over to right after this first colon, and since this is VI, I just hold down my X key, or the X character on the keyboard, to delete all those out, so that I basically just have two colons. This is basically setting the password to blank. So I'll go ahead and then use a colon, WQ, exclamation mark, and command down here at the bottom. This is command mode in VI, so that this will actually go ahead and write this file and quit. So you can see that I still have the same files that were in here before. So now what I need to do is basically compress this back up, put it back into its original format, put it back onto the drive, and we'll reboot. So now we boot it up, you can see where it says press F12 to shut down and restart. So F12 basically lets me access the menu where I can do certain things. Again, if I try and log in with the wrong password, it doesn't really care what I enter there because there is no password. If I press F12, I can leave my password blank, and you can see that it's not giving me an incorrect password message like it was before. All right, so that is hacking into a VMware server. So as you can see, that was a very quick process. All in all, it took me probably 15 minutes tops to be able to crack that system. So if someone can gain physical access to these types of devices, they can basically own them. They can hack in, they can change the password, they can give themselves access to it. You could create new user accounts if you wanted to. So there are these types of attacks that we call an advanced persistent threat. So of course, if someone really wanted long-term access to this system, all they'd really need to do is just create another user account and be able to continue gaining access to it or continue accessing it over and over and over. And we're not talking about advanced persistent threats today, but it is something that you want to be aware of. You know, especially since a live CD is really not that difficult to come across. You can download various different copies. I think we used Hirons in that video, but live CDs exist for various different distributions of Linux. So it's definitely something you want to be familiar with and make sure that people cannot actually access your systems. Whether it's a server like we were looking at there or whether it's your Wi-Fi access points, you're making sure that they're actually hidden above a drop ceiling or perhaps locked in a closet, making sure that people can't just access your routers and your switches by walking right up to the device. If it's in a locked telecom closet or what we call an IDF, of course, they won't be able to get to those types of things and change the configurations and do various different types of malicious things to them, right? So that takes us into number 4 here, not using encryption. So I actually just posted a video on YouTube, I think it was last week or so, about a website actually not using encryption. I don't have a short clip of that one to share with you, but there's various different websites out there that are not using encryption whatsoever. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't a website that was taking credit card payments. If you're just using the lack of encryption for something like, granted Google uses encryption even just for standard Google searches, but encryption probably isn't really that big of a deal for just protecting your Google searches, right? But if you're going to be submitting credit card information or social security numbers or various other what we call PII, personally identifiable information across the internet, you want to make sure that these websites are actually using encryption. And just to kind of show you the example that I used the other day, I'm hoping that they've actually started using encryption by now because we have at least told them about this. But if I come over here and tell you what, let me go ahead and pull up the website here first. Then we'll switch over to it. So it's www.athensclerkofcourt.com. So of course they have the ability to actually come in here and purchase certain court records. So now of course when I come over here you'll see that there is an HTTPS, which is good. It automatically redirected me there. So of course now when I go search for party name, perhaps Smith, it is doing everything in an HTTPS environment. So someone apparently somewhere saw my YouTube video and said, hey, this guy's right. We should be using encryption. If you want to go see the video, check out my YouTube channel. Of course, for those on the webinar, it's David Staples GA. It's one of the last probably 5 videos or so that I uploaded. And it will actually show I'm running Wireshark in the background as I go to connect to this website. I make a credit card payment using a PayPal debit card that I don't really use for anything that isn't linked to any accounts. But it's one that I use for certain security types of testing. And so I was able to actually submit that credit card payment and then basically go through and look through the packets, and I can show you the exact credit card number. And granted, I had to blur it out for the video, but I can actually show you all the information that was sent across the web to this particular website. So I am very glad to see that they have started using encryption here. So that's the type of impact that perhaps we can have on the internet sometimes when we make these YouTube videos and whatnot, right? But in addition to not using encryption for transport, of course, we also need to make sure that we're using encryption at rest. This is something that's very, very easy to do. Why people aren't using things like BitLocker and why they're not using things like File Vault on the Mac, there's really not much of an excuse because it is very, very easy to set up. Just to kind of show you here on the Mac, there is an option, and I'm going to go ahead and pull that up here real quick. So I have security and privacy. And we'll drag that over here before I share the screen. So you can see that there is an option here for File Vault. File Vault basically secures the data on the disk by encrypting its contents automatically. So of course, right now you can see that mine is turned on because it has the option to turn off File Vault. But this is something that everyone needs to be using, whether it's a laptop or a desktop computer, because kind of going back to that physical security type concept. If something is encrypted, it doesn't necessarily matter as much that someone has physical access to it. But especially when we look at things like laptops, how many laptops do you think get lost, misplaced, stolen in a year's time frame? If someone can basically just boot the computer right up, or even take the computer apart, take the hard drive out of it, stick it in another computer, and access all the data, well, we still haven't really done our job of protecting that computer's data, right? So we do definitely want to make sure that we are using things like this file vault on the Mac, or like using BitLocker on the PC. And of course, there are plenty of third-party utilities from companies like Norton and Symantec and other companies as well to allow us to actually enable these types of encryption. So encryption is topic number 4, that, again, you definitely want to make sure that you're using encryption in just about everything that you are doing, if not everything that you are doing, because, of course, encryption is crackable, it's hackable, but the stronger encryption that we are using, the harder it is on the attacker to be able to go ahead and compromise that particular data. So the last example of things that people commonly do that are basically cybersecurity mistakes are backups. So when we look at all the data that our organization uses to run on, how much of that data is actually backed up in your enterprise? Now, I can't mention the client, obviously, but I can tell you that it wasn't that long ago when I was out teaching a Security Plus course of all courses at a particular place. And as we were talking about backups, I typically ask, what kind of backups do you guys have in place, just so that we can kind of spur some conversation. I said, well, we back up some things. We just don't back up our desktops or our laptops. So really, so what happens when the hard drive in one of those dies? Well, we just kind of lose the data. So no matter whether it's like a higher-end manager or a CEO or CFO or CIO or even just someone in accounting, can you imagine losing data for however long you've been using that computer? We really don't have much of an excuse to not be doing backups. Backups are very easy to do. Data storage is cheap. You can buy a terabyte hard drive for less than $100. So why we're not actually using backups in some instances, again, we really don't have much of an excuse, right? So just to kind of give you an example of how easy it is to back up, you can actually set Windows with Active Directory. You can actually set it to back up your desktop and various other home directories, such as the My Documents or My Pictures, My Movies, My Music. You can actually have it back those up to a remote server automatically for you and basically constantly sync that. Why people are not using that option, I have no idea. That is actually one of the things that we've actually used at multiple different companies that I've worked for. And this was a organization that kind of prides itself on security. So again, why they weren't backing up individual desktops and laptops, hopefully they will be making some security changes to that, or making some changes to those processes and procedures to do that here in the very near future, especially now that some more other people do have a Security Plus. I'm happy to say that pretty much everyone from that class passed. And again, if you guys do need training on any of these types of things, feel free to check out the website up here at the top right of the screen, www.atglearning.com. We're happy to come out and help you actually get your certifications as well. So off-site backup is another key important piece. I know that a lot of people think, well, I've got my backups, backup tapes are in this locked room over here, but off-site is definitely another thing that you really want to make sure that you're actually doing. There's a couple of different instances that come to mind with this, especially one that kind of goes back to one of the days when I'd already left this organization, but a good friend of mine basically was still a senior systems engineer for this company, and we were sitting around his apartment one night, or at Starbucks, I forget where we were, but he got a call from his boss, and his boss goes, well, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for you. It's like, okay, great, so I guess give me the good news first. He's like, well, the good news is, number one, you're not fired, so don't worry, this is not anything bad, but you don't have to come into the office tomorrow. He goes, okay, cool. So that means that there's a catch. What's the bad news? And of course, the bad news was that this was around 2005, I think it was, when Hurricane Katrina and Rita had just hit. And the bad news was that he had to drive down to New Orleans with a U-Haul and pick up 2 big racks of servers, RAID arrays, switches, routers, and basically bring them back up to the particular city that we were working in at the time. So without an off-site backup, of course, all that data would have been lost. Now, of course, as he got back up to where we lived, he pulled the U-Haul in probably about 9 o'clock at night or whatever, and I just kind of came over for a little bit to hang out, and we pulled a couple of the RAID arrays off that were on the very top shelf, and brought him into his apartment. And I can recommend that if you happen to have a RAID array and a small apartment, that if you want to maintain your hearing, it sounds like a Gulfstream kind of trying to start up its engines. Those things do get really loud in a very small space, so definitely want to avoid that too. But again, the mistake here is not having offsite backups. If that company didn't have an offsite backup, in its main data center, they very well could have lost any sort of business that they were doing there in the New Orleans area. So offsite backups can help us protect against things like natural disasters. If you've got a fire, there are various different terrorism acts that we have to be worried about as well these days. I can tell you that there's an organization here in Atlanta that I've taught a variety of different security classes to, and SQL Server classes to, that they actually even take their tapes 2 hours away. So essentially they rotate responsibilities. It's what we call job rotation, where once a week someone actually drives the tapes from their backup to a location 2 hours away, and then they actually store them at that other office. So having an offsite backup, whether it's something that transmits over the network or it's physically carrying your tapes somewhere else, is definitely a very, very good idea to make sure that we stay in business. Usually one of the examples that I use in my security classes, whether it's the CSA Plus or the CASP class or the just Security Plus, and we even talk about these types of things in A Plus and Network Plus as well, is kind of look at some of the extreme examples out there. Maybe 9/11. When the World Trade Center came down, or the two towers came down, if someone's data was only located in that building, how much business are they doing after 9/11? They're probably not really going to be able to do a whole lot, right? Because even if their people were able to escape, they still can't really access their data. They're not really in business anymore other than just on paper, perhaps in the Secretary of State's office. So you always want to make sure that you are backing up everything and backing it up off-site as well. Again, whether that's physically taking the data off-site or whether it's actually transmitting it over to the network to perhaps a hot site where it is constantly ready to basically come online in the case that something does go down. So again, those are the 5 things that you really want to make sure that you're doing. Mistakes that people commonly make that they're not doing these days. And I hope you've enjoyed that. Again, we've got the passwords. Make sure that you're using a strong password. Make sure that you do actually go into your servers and your different systems. Make sure that those services aren't actually sharing out version numbers. Again, things do get patched as time goes on, so the next version hopefully will fix whatever the previous versions didn't. But if we want to make sure that the attackers don't know what the vulnerabilities are in these systems, then we need to make sure that we're removing those version numbers at a very minimum from the software. If you can remove the software name as well, such as getting rid of that Apache or Nginx and just say generic web server, that would be even better. Physical security, again, make sure that your assets are all physically secured so that people can't just carry them away and have all the time in the world that they need to break into it. Make sure that you're using encryption, whether it's to send proprietary data or credit card information, what we call PII, that personally identifiable information. And again, making sure that you're actually backing things up, whether it's offsite or onsite, and then making sure that those on-site backups do eventually make it off-site as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'm going to go ahead and open it up to any sort of questions or answers. Again, we do have Patrick Lane, the Director of Products from CompTIA, here with us as well. So thank you for being with us, Patrick. And either one of us are happy to answer any sort of questions that you've got, and I've got the questions over here to my side and behind me. So if you've got any questions, feel free to send those through the chat or through the Q&A. And Patrick or I or both are happy to answer anything that you've got here. And in the meantime, I will hang out here for just a little while. So if anyone has any sort of questions whatsoever, whether it's about training, whether it's about the CompTIA A+, Network Plus, Security Plus, the CSA Plus, the CASP exam, the CompTIA Advanced Security Practitioner, happy to answer any sort of questions that you may have. And I know that there's a little bit of a delay here, so I'm trying to kind of hang out just a little while to make sure that everyone has had a chance to answer any or ask any questions that they've got. And I'm not seeing any either place, but Patrick, if you'd like to Chime in if there's anything you'd like to say. Feel free to share any sort of thoughts or comments that you'd like to here as well.
Can you hear me, David? This is Patrick.
Yeah, sure can.
Patrick, if you'd like to comment, if there's anything you'd like to say, feel free to share any sort of thoughts or comments that you'd like to hear as well. All right, can you hear me right now? Oh, there we go. Excellent. All right, yes, I was just listening to your presentation, and my question, it was in training, because you mentioned a lot of Linux skills, and you've also mentioned the APTs, the Advanced Persistent Threats. Two different topics I've heard with your recent CompTIA certifications. And so, my question is, if you're talking about advanced persistent threats, we've just created the CSA Plus certificates. The skills you talked about here, you talked about a lot of Linux skills. Do you see when people go into this profession that Linux skills are going to be used more than Windows skills? This is my question, I guess, because at CompTIA we approach things in a vendor-neutral perspective, and we try to teach both Windows skills and Linux skills, if at all possible, to not be vendor specific, I guess. So my question is, you can show a lot of Linux examples. Do you think that's an area that our IT players really need to focus on?
Hey, thanks. I know that there's a little bit of a delay here, so hopefully everyone heard Patrick's question here. But is Linux going to be more prevalent than Windows? I would say that it really depends upon the organization, really. I've worked for, again, some pretty large organizations. In fact, the last one that I worked for even used AS400 still. So it's one of those things that we just kind of have to look at on a case-by-case basis. Linux is used very heavily with a number of organizations. In fact, I believe Apache is what the most prevalent web hosting software in the world. So that's one of the reasons that I particularly focus on Linux. Just because a lot of the things that I've done have been in Apache or have been in Nginx or various other Linux systems for the different web technologies. And that's not to say that Windows doesn't have a place in those environments either. Of course, people do use Windows Server, especially for things like SharePoint. I think SharePoint is one of Microsoft's most, I guess, biggest profit centers from some of the information that I've seen. So, of course, with it being a web-based technology that runs under IIS, of course, that's going to be very important too. Now, of course, with Microsoft's Azure, of course, they do have Linux available under there as well. That's actually where my virtual machine is running. It's a Linux machine running under Microsoft's Azure product. And of course, if some of you guys haven't seen the things from Microsoft lately, there have been some things saying "I love Linux" from Microsoft. So Microsoft, I think, is heading in the Linux direction as well. In fact, I've seen where there's actually even a Bash shell available for Windows 10, and I haven't gotten around to installing that yet. But Linux skills are definitely a very important piece, especially in the security world. There's a lot of tools out there for Linux users to be able to do a number of different things. So I've got another. Did that answer your question, Patrick? So I guess in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and answer this next question. Feel free to. Oh,
Yes, it does. The Linux skills certainly are becoming more important. I know we are looking at updating our Linux Plus exam right now, and
wonderful.
those numbers continue to rise with Linux Plus, which would bolster what you were saying.
Yep, I do have my Linux Plus as well, which it is definitely a great exam. Um, there's two exams for the Linux Plus for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and it is actually a fairly difficult exam. And that's kind of one of the things that I told. I actually just taught this class to the military just a couple weeks ago or so, and when I go into those, I basically mention that this is a really difficult exam. It's scored on a what is that, a 200 to 800 scale, and a 500 as passing. So you really only have to get about half the answers correct to pass the exam. But of course, there's all sorts of different things on there. That Linux is a rather complicated operating system. So not knowing exactly what they're going to be asking you on the exam, we try and kind of show people as much as we possibly can and get them to actually get enough hands-on with these systems as much as possible for that particular exam. So looking forward to seeing the new updates. I actually did the 101 and 102, and then just I guess after that they came out with the 103 and 104 was the next set for the Linux Plus. So I'd imagine the next ones will be the 105 and 106, and so I'll go take those as soon as I see them come out. But yes, Linux skills are definitely very, very important. So I do have a question here from Robert Parker. I'll go ahead and answer as well. It says, "Hi David, I'm working on my CEH. Been in IT for about 5 years now and have my MCSA, which I took the 3 tests at your location in Atlanta. Any suggestions where to go cert-wise after I obtain the CEH?" And so the CEH, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the Certified Ethical Hacker. So Certified Ethical Hacker is another really good certification to have. It's of course not a CompTIA certification. I think the CEH, if I'm not mistaken, is EC Council. Sometimes trying to keep all these different certifications straight can be a chore because there's a lot of different certifying organizations out there. After the CEH, if you don't have your CASP, the CompTIA Advanced Security Practitioner, that one might be a good one. There's also the new Cybersecurity Analyst Plus, which is kind of a step below the CASP and would be one that I recommend if you haven't kind of started down that road of security concepts yet. I always typically recommend kind of starting at the Security Plus, then into CSA Plus, and then CASP. They do get a little bit harder little by little as time goes on, or as the test progresses up to the next level. Another good one's going to be the CISP. Seems to be a very popular one as well. So that's CISSP. There are all sorts of different security certifications, though. One of the ones that would really take a lot of working up to. I think there's a 24-hour exam out there. It's called the OWASP, O-W-A-S-P. It's like the Online Warfare or something or other. So that's one that I would be very interested in pursuing perhaps one day. But after the CEH, I would probably look at something from CompTIA, whether it's the Security Plus, CSA Plus, or the CASP. Especially when it comes to employers, I know that some of them do actually have a requirement to have a Security Plus. Even if you have a lot of experience in IT, it's good to actually have the certification just so that you can show them, yes, I do actually have this certification. I know what I'm talking about, and then you can of course progress on up to the other ones from there. So it looks like there's perhaps no other questions here, but if I see one come across in the meantime, I'm happy to answer anything that you've got. So of course I've got YouTube behind me, I've got the webinar software over to the left, and my streaming software here in front of me, just trying to keep up with everyone. But if there's no other questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap up here. So again, I do want to thank you all for coming out and joining us on this Thursday afternoon. I suppose it's afternoon here anyways. Again, thank you to Patrick Lane, the Director of Products from CompTIA, for joining us here as well. Also want to thank ATG. Of course, ATG is sponsoring this webinar and allowing me to come broadcast from work today. I'm not typically doing this kind of stuff at work. Usually I might record a video or two during my lunch break, but not really able to actually live stream like this from the office. So suppose if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and call it a day then. So again, thank you everyone for watching. Be sure to check out atglearning.com, check out the CompTIA.org website for the various different CompTIA certifications, and be sure to check out and subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. It's just David Staples GA. I certainly appreciate you watching and tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time. You guys take care.